Picture this: you're dining at the most exclusive restaurant in London, surrounded by the finest chefs in the world, with access to any delicacy money can buy. Yet you push away your plate, refusing to take even a single bite. Now imagine you're the future King of England, and this moment is being watched by millions. What could possibly make Prince William, heir to the British throne, reject royal cuisine that has been prepared for centuries? The answer isn't what you think. It's not about allergies, health concerns, or royal protocol. It's about something far more personal, something that reaches deep into the heart of what it means to be human, to be a father, and, surprisingly, to be royal in the modern world. This is the untold story of how a prince's relationship with food became a window into his soul, revealing truths about the British royal family that have never been shared before. Buckle up, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Prince William and the hidden struggles of royal life. The grand dining hall at Buckingham Palace stretched before them like a scene from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across mahogany tables that had hosted kings and queens for over 2 centuries. The finest china bore the royal crest, each piece worth more than most people's monthly salary. Silver cutlery gleamed under the warm light, polished to perfection by staff who had dedicated their lives to serving the crown. But Prince William sat at the head of the table, staring at his untouched plate with an expression that palace staff had learned to recognize. It was the look of a man caught between two worlds, between duty and personal conviction, between tradition and change. The evening had started like any other formal dinner at the palace. Foreign dignitaries filled the ornate chairs, their conversations flowing as freely as the expensive wine. The menu had been planned weeks in advance, each dish carefully selected to honor both British culinary tradition and the cultural preferences of their international guests. The royal chefs had outdone themselves, preparing delicacies that would make food critics weep with joy. Yet there sat the future King of England, his fork untouched beside a plate that represented everything wrong with his relationship with food. Lady Margaret Thornberry, a longtime family friend seated to his right, noticed his hesitation first. She had known William since he was a child, had watched him grow from a mischievous boy into the composed man he was today. But, in that moment, she saw something in his eyes that transported her back 20 years, to a conversation that had changed everything. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the truth. Here was a man who would one day rule over a kingdom famous for its culinary traditions, from fish and chips to afternoon tea, from roast beef to shepherd's pie. The British Empire had been built partly on the spice trade, bringing flavors from around the world to English tables. Royal feasts were legendary, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by food historians and cultural experts. But Prince William had developed what palace insiders quietly called the problem. It wasn't medical, it wasn't psychological in any clinical sense, and it certainly wasn't a publicity stunt. It was something far more profound and personal than anyone outside his immediate circle could have imagined. The problem had started innocuously enough during his university years at St. Andrews. Like any college student, William had experimented with different foods, different ways of eating, different approaches to the sustenance that fueled his demanding schedule. But, unlike other students, every meal William ate was scrutinized, photographed when possible, and analyzed by royal watchers around the world. What began as simple preferences had evolved into something much more complex. By the time he graduated, William had developed an almost instinctive aversion to certain categories of food. Not because of taste, not because of texture, but because of what those foods represented in the broader context of his life and future responsibilities. The palace staff had tried everything. They brought in nutritionists, consulted with psychologists who specialized in eating disorders, even arranged private consultations with renowned chefs who had worked with celebrities facing similar challenges. But each expert who met with William came away with the same conclusion: this wasn't a disorder that could be treated with traditional methods. Dr. Sarah Chen, a nutritional psychologist who had worked with the royal family on various health initiatives, spent 3 months trying to understand William's relationship with food. Her final report, buried deep in palace files and never meant for public consumption, concluded that the prince's food aversions were actually a manifestation of something much deeper and more complex. His Royal Highness, she wrote, has developed what I can only describe as a moral relationship with food that extends far beyond personal preference. Every meal, for him, has become a statement about values, responsibility, and the kind of leader he wishes to become. The dinner continued around him, guests engaged in animated discussions about trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic initiatives. But William's mind was elsewhere, transported back to the moment when his relationship with food had fundamentally changed forever. It had been a Tuesday afternoon in March, exactly 7 years earlier. William was reviewing documents in his private study when a knock came at the door. His private secretary entered, carrying a folder marked with the highest level of confidentiality. Inside were photographs and reports that would haunt the prince for years to come. The images showed children in various parts of the Commonwealth, countries where his grandmother served as head of state, children whose lives had been devastated by food insecurity, malnutrition, and starvation. But these weren't the sanitized images typically shown in charity appeals or news reports. These were raw, unfiltered documentation of human suffering on a scale that William had never fully comprehended despite years of charitable work. One photograph, in particular, had stopped him cold. A little girl, no older than his son George would eventually be, sitting beside an empty bowl in what had once been a thriving agricultural community. Her eyes held a mixture of hope and resignation that seemed to speak directly to William's soul. The accompanying report explained that crop failures, exacerbated by climate change and poor agricultural policy, had left entire regions without adequate food supplies. But the most devastating part of the report wasn't about the crisis itself. It was about the response, or rather, the lack thereof. While communities struggled to feed their children, massive amounts of food were being wasted daily in wealthier nations. Restaurants discarded perfectly good meals, grocery stores threw away produce that didn't meet aesthetic standards, and households routinely bought more food than they could consume. The statistics were staggering. In the time it would take William to enjoy a typical royal feast, thousands of children in Commonwealth nations would go to bed hungry. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, the moral weight crushing. That evening, William had returned to his apartments and stared at his dinner with new eyes. The roasted pheasant, prepared according to a recipe passed down through generations of royal chefs, suddenly seemed obscene. The delicate vegetables, arranged with artistic precision, felt like a mockery of the empty bowls he had seen in the photographs. Every bite he might take felt like a betrayal of the children who had nothing. Kate had found him there an hour later, his meal untouched and growing cold. She had seen the reports, understood immediately what was happening in her husband's mind and heart. That night, they had talked until dawn about responsibility, privilege, and the impossible burden of caring for people you would never meet but whose welfare rested, in some small way, on decisions made in palaces and parliament buildings. The conversation had changed both of them, but it had affected William more profoundly. Kate maintained her ability to enjoy food while remaining committed to charitable causes. She could compartmentalize, could recognize that her personal consumption didn't directly impact global hunger issues. But William couldn't make that mental separation. For him, every meal became a moral calculation. Could he justify eating expensive delicacies while children starved? Could he participate in the elaborate food rituals of royal life while representing people who struggled to afford basic nutrition? The questions consumed him, transforming what should have been simple acts of nourishment into complex ethical dilemmas. The palace psychiatrist, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, had worked with the royal family for 15 years. She had helped them navigate personal losses, public scandals, and the unique psychological pressures of life in the spotlight. But William's relationship with food presented challenges she had never encountered. "It's not anorexia," she explained to a small group of trusted advisors during a confidential briefing. "It's not bulimia, and it's not any form of eating disorder as we traditionally understand them. What His Royal Highness is experiencing is a form of moral injury related to privilege and responsibility." She went on to explain that William's food aversions were actually a healthy psychological response to an unhealthy situation. His conscience was rejecting the disconnect between his privileged position and the suffering of others. The problem wasn't with his mind, it was with a system that allowed such extreme inequality to exist. But understanding the psychology didn't solve the practical problems. William still needed to eat, still needed to participate in state dinners and official functions where food played a central role. The palace staff had developed elaborate workarounds, carefully managing his public appearances to minimize situations where his food issues might become apparent. They had also begun incorporating his concerns into the broader royal charitable agenda. The Prince's Trust, William's primary charitable organization, had quietly shifted focus toward food security initiatives. Working with partners around the world, they had launched programs aimed at reducing food waste, improving agricultural practices in developing nations, and addressing the systemic issues that created food insecurity in the first place. But none of these efforts seemed to ease William's personal struggle with food. If anything, the more he learned about global hunger issues, the more difficult it became for him to enjoy meals. Each new report, each new crisis, each new photograph of suffering children made his own privileged access to food feel more and more inappropriate. The dinner around him continued, guests unaware of the internal battle being waged in their host's mind. William forced himself to take small bites, enough to maintain appearances without drawing attention to his discomfort. Years of practice had taught him to navigate these situations without creating diplomatic incidents or media speculation. But Lady Margaret, watching him carefully, could see the toll it was taking. She remembered a different William, a young man who had enjoyed food with the uncomplicated pleasure of youth. That William was gone, replaced by someone who carried the weight of the world's suffering on his shoulders with every meal. As the evening progressed, William's thoughts turned to his children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were still young enough to enjoy food without moral complications. They delighted in birthday cakes and holiday treats, in family picnics and casual meals. But he knew that someday, they too would face the reality of their position, the weight of privilege, the responsibility that came with their titles. Would they develop the same food issues he had? Would they struggle with the same moral contradictions? The thought kept him awake at nights, wondering how to prepare his children for a life of service while protecting them from the psychological burdens he carried. The irony was that William's food problems had actually made him a more effective advocate for hunger relief initiatives. His visceral understanding of the moral weight of food inequality gave him a passion and authenticity that resonated with both charitable organizations and government officials. When he spoke about hunger, people listened, because they could sense that this wasn't just another royal cause he had adopted for appearances. But the personal cost was enormous. Food, which should have been a source of comfort and pleasure, had become a daily reminder of global injustice. Every meal was a confrontation with his own privilege, every bite a question about his right to luxury while others suffered. As the formal dinner finally drew to a close, William felt the familiar mixture of relief and exhaustion that followed these events. He had managed to get through another evening without incident, had fulfilled his obligations without drawing unwanted attention to his struggles. But he knew that tomorrow would bring another meal, another opportunity for internal conflict, another reminder of the impossible contradictions of his position. The guests began to filter out, offering polite thanks and diplomatic pleasantries. William stood at the door, shaking hands and exchanging final words with each departing dignitary. But his mind was already moving forward, to the next day's schedule, the next meal he would need to navigate, the next opportunity to balance his personal convictions with his public responsibilities. As the last guest departed and the dining hall fell quiet, William remained standing in the doorway, looking back at the remnants of the evening. Empty plates bearing the traces of elaborate meals, crystal glasses still holding the dregs of expensive wines, silverware arranged with mathematical precision on pristine tablecloths. It was beautiful, he had to admit. The palace staff had outdone themselves once again, creating an evening that would be remembered by guests as a perfect example of British hospitality and royal grandeur. But, for William, it represented something else entirely, another evening spent wrestling with the fundamental contradictions of his position, another battle in his ongoing war with food and privilege and responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new meals, new opportunities for internal conflict. But it would also bring new chances to make a difference, to use his position and influence to address the very issues that tormented him. The work would continue, the struggle would persist, but so would his determination to find a way forward. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across William's private breakfast room. Unlike the grand dining halls used for official functions, this space was intimate, almost ordinary by royal standards. Here, away from the cameras and diplomatic protocol, the future King of England could attempt something that had become increasingly difficult, eating a simple meal. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison had been preparing breakfast for the royal family for 12 years. She took pride in her work, carefully selecting the finest ingredients and preparing meals that balanced nutrition with the refined tastes expected in royal households. But, lately, her job had become more complicated than she had ever imagined. The instructions were specific, delivered through a chain of command that included the prince's private secretary, the head of household staff, and the palace nutritionist. Prince William's breakfast was to be simple, locally sourced when possible, and prepared with minimal waste. Nothing exotic, nothing that could be considered unnecessarily extravagant, nothing that might trigger what palace staff had learned to call his episodes. Mrs. Morrison didn't fully understand what had changed in the prince over the years. She remembered when he was younger, less burdened, more willing to enjoy the culinary privileges of his position. He had particularly loved her homemade pastries, would often compliment the kitchen staff on especially well-prepared meals, and showed genuine interest in learning about different cooking techniques and ingredients. That enthusiasm had gradually disappeared, replaced by a careful, almost clinical approach to eating that concerned everyone who knew him well. Mrs. Morrison had been briefed by Dr. Chen about the prince's psychological relationship with food, but the academic explanations didn't capture the heartbreak of watching someone struggle with something as basic as nourishment. This morning's breakfast consisted of porridge made from oats grown on the Duchy of Cornwall farms, fresh fruit from the palace gardens, and toast from bread baked in the palace kitchens using traditional methods. Every component had been chosen to minimize the moral complications that seemed to plague William's relationship with food. Local ingredients, minimal environmental impact, simple preparation that didn't require excessive labor or resources. William entered the breakfast room at exactly 7:30, as had become his routine. Punctuality was one of the few aspects of his life that remained unchanged despite his ongoing struggles. He offered a polite good morning to the staff member who served his meal, but Mrs. Morrison could see the familiar tension in his shoulders, the slight hesitation as he approached the table. The previous evening's dinner had been particularly challenging. The French ambassador's visit had required a formal feast featuring traditional British delicacies alongside French culinary masterpieces. William had managed to fulfill his hosting duties without incident, but Mrs. Morrison had heard from the cleaning staff that his private dinner afterward had been left almost entirely untouched. As William sat down to breakfast, his thoughts were already racing ahead to the day's schedule. A visit to a local food bank was planned for the afternoon, part of an ongoing initiative to address food insecurity in London communities. These visits had become both easier and harder for him over the years. Easier because they connected him directly with the issues that concerned him most deeply, harder because they reinforced the stark contrasts that made his own eating so psychologically complex. The porridge was perfectly prepared, warm and comforting, flavored with honey produced by beehives maintained on royal properties. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an ideal breakfast. But William found himself calculating the cost per serving, thinking about how many meals could be provided to food bank clients for the same amount of money spent on his single breakfast. The calculations were becoming automatic, involuntary. He would look at food and immediately begin computing alternative uses for the same resources. A single royal dinner could fund a week's worth of school lunches for underprivileged children. The cost of importing exotic fruits for palace meals could support local farming initiatives in struggling communities. The labor hours spent preparing elaborate dishes for royal functions could be redirected toward meal preparation for homeless shelters. Dr. Hartwell had warned him about this type of thinking. During their sessions, she explained that his mind had developed what psychologists called resource anxiety, a condition where individuals become hyper-aware of resource allocation and waste. In most cases, it affected people who had experienced scarcity firsthand. But William's version was unique, triggered not by personal deprivation but by his expanding awareness of global inequality. "You're essentially experiencing empathy overload," Dr. Hartwell had explained during one of their sessions. "Your emotional capacity to connect with suffering has exceeded your psychological ability to compartmentalize. It's actually a sign of moral development, but it's also unsustainable without proper coping mechanisms." The coping mechanisms were still a work in progress. William had tried meditation, had worked with cognitive behavioral therapists, had even experimented with eating disorders specialists despite the fact that his condition didn't fit traditional diagnostic categories. Nothing had provided lasting relief from the moral weight that seemed to accompany every meal. Kate entered the breakfast room as William was pushing his half-finished porridge around the bowl. She had learned to recognize the signs of a difficult morning, could read his moods and struggles with the intuition that came from years of marriage and shared challenges. Her own relationship with food had evolved in response to his struggles, but she had managed to maintain a healthier balance between concern for global issues and personal well-being. "The children are asking about the food bank visit today," she said, settling into the chair beside him with her own simple breakfast. "George wants to know if he can help pack meals." William's expression softened slightly. His children represented one of the few areas of his life where the food-related complications hadn't taken complete hold. He could still enjoy sharing meals with them, could still find pleasure in their uncomplicated delight in birthday cakes and holiday treats. But even those moments were tinged with worry about how to prepare them for the realities they would eventually face. "He's getting old enough to understand some of these issues," William replied, finally, taking another small bite of porridge. "Maybe it's time to start including him in more of these visits, let him see firsthand what we're working toward." The conversation turned to logistics for the day's events, but both of them were thinking about the broader implications. How do you raise children in extreme privilege while teaching them about global inequality? How do you prepare future royals for lives of service without burdening them with the psychological weight that had become so central to William's existence? These questions had no easy answers, but they had become central to William and Kate's approach to parenting. They were trying to raise children who would be conscious of their privilege without being paralyzed by it, who would feel responsibility without being crushed by guilt, who would serve others without losing themselves in the process. The breakfast concluded with William having consumed perhaps half of what had been prepared for him. Mrs. Morrison would receive the standard instruction to prepare slightly smaller portions the next day, an ongoing adjustment process aimed at reducing waste while ensuring adequate nutrition. It was a delicate balance, one that had required extensive consultation with nutritionists and palace staff. As William prepared to leave for his morning meetings, he paused to look out the window at the palace gardens. The view was beautiful, peaceful, representing centuries of careful cultivation and maintenance. But, lately, even the gardens had begun to feel morally complicated. The resources devoted to maintaining ornamental landscaping could support urban farming initiatives, could provide fresh produce for communities that lacked access to healthy food options. Every aspect of royal life had become filtered through this lens of resource allocation and moral responsibility. The paintings on the walls, the antique furniture, the carefully maintained buildings themselves, all represented investments that could theoretically be redirected toward addressing human suffering. The logical conclusion of this thinking was impossible to contemplate, but the thoughts persisted nonetheless. William's first meeting of the day was with representatives from the Trussell Trust, Britain's largest food bank network. The organization had been working with the royal family for several years on initiatives to address the growing problem of food insecurity in the UK. But, for William, these meetings had become particularly significant, representing one of the few areas where his food-related concerns aligned directly with practical action. The statistics presented during the meeting were sobering. Food bank usage had increased dramatically over the previous 5 years, with working families increasingly unable to afford adequate nutrition despite being employed. Children were arriving at school hungry, elderly people were choosing between heating their homes and buying food, and families were regularly skipping meals to ensure their children could eat. Sarah Thompson, the Trust's director, had worked with William on multiple occasions and had come to recognize his deep personal investment in these issues. She had initially attributed his passion to typical royal commitment to charitable causes, but, over time had realized that his concern went far deeper than professional obligation. "Your Royal Highness," she said during a pause in the presentation, "your advocacy has been instrumental in raising awareness about these issues. The personal touch you bring to these visits, the genuine emotion you show when meeting with food bank clients, it's made a real difference in how the public understands food insecurity." William nodded, but, internally he was wrestling with the familiar contradiction. His advocacy was indeed making a difference, was helping to address the very problems that caused him such personal anguish. But, every day he delayed eating breakfast, every meal he struggled to complete, represented time and energy that could have been directed toward more productive activities. The meeting continued with discussions of new initiatives, potential partnerships, and innovative approaches to addressing food insecurity. William found himself energized by the practical focus, the opportunity to channel his concerns into concrete action. This was what made the struggle worthwhile, what justified the personal cost of his heightened awareness of food-related inequality. Dr. Chen had explained this phenomenon during one of their consultations. "You're experiencing what we call productive guilt," she had said. "The emotional discomfort you feel around food is actually motivating increased charitable action and advocacy. It's psychologically costly, but it's also generating positive outcomes for the communities you're trying to serve." The question was sustainability. Could William continue to operate at this level of moral intensity without eventually burning out? Could he maintain his advocacy effectiveness while finding ways to reduce the personal psychological cost? These were questions that Dr. Chen and Dr. Hartwell continued to explore, but the answers remained elusive. The afternoon food bank visit provided both relief and additional challenges. Walking through the facility, meeting with families who relied on donated food to survive, William felt a sense of purpose that was often missing from his more traditional royal duties. These interactions were real, immediate, and directly connected to the issues that had come to define his relationship with food. But they also reinforced the contrasts that made eating so difficult. After spending an afternoon with families who carefully rationed every meal, who made difficult choices about nutrition based on what was available rather than what they preferred. Returning to the palace for dinner felt almost obscene. The evening meal was deliberately simple, prepared according to the guidelines that had evolved over months of trial and error. Local ingredients, minimal waste, straightforward preparation. But even these modifications couldn't completely eliminate the psychological weight that accompanied every bite. As William prepared for bed that evening, he reflected on the day's events. The meetings had been productive, the food bank visit meaningful, the ongoing charitable work genuinely impactful. But the internal struggle with food remained unchanged, a constant companion that colored every aspect of his relationship with nourishment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to address the issues that concerned him most deeply, and new meals to navigate. The work would continue, the struggle would persist, but so would his determination to use his position and privilege in service of something larger than himself. The cost was enormous, but the alternative, ignoring the suffering he had become so aware of, was unthinkable. The future King of England fell asleep thinking not about crowns or ceremonies or constitutional responsibilities, but about empty bowls and hungry children and the impossible weight of caring too much in a world that often seemed to care too little. The call came at 6:15 in the morning, jolting William from a restless sleep that had been punctuated by dreams of empty plates and hungry faces. His private secretary's voice carried an urgency that immediately signaled crisis, the kind that required immediate royal attention and careful public handling. "Sir, we've received reports from the Ethiopian delegation. The famine situation has deteriorated significantly overnight. The Prime Minister's office is requesting your immediate input on the humanitarian response, and there's been a request for royal involvement in the emergency aid coordination." William sat up in bed, his mind instantly sharp despite the early hour. Ethiopia had been experiencing severe drought conditions for months, but the situation had apparently reached a tipping point that demanded international intervention. For most people, such a call would represent a professional challenge, a matter of diplomatic responsibility and charitable obligation. For William, it was something far more personal and immediate. The Ethiopian crisis wasn't an abstract policy issue, it was a direct confrontation with the very realities that had transformed his relationship with food and fundamentally altered his understanding of his role as future king. Within an hour, he was dressed and seated in the secure briefing room at Kensington Palace, surrounded by advisors from the Foreign Office, representatives from major humanitarian organizations, and staff members who specialized in coordinating royal charitable initiatives. The room's walls were covered with maps, photographs, and statistical projections that painted a devastating picture of human suffering. Dr. Amanda Richards from Doctors Without Borders provided the briefing, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the emotional weight of what she was reporting. The drought had affected over 6 million people, with nearly 2 million children under the age of 5 facing severe acute malnutrition. The images she shared were haunting: children whose bodies showed the unmistakable signs of starvation, mothers who had walked for days seeking food for their families, communities where wells had run dry and crops had withered under an unforgiving sun. William found himself studying each photograph with an intensity that concerned the other people in the room. His hands gripped the edge of the conference table, his jaw clenched as he absorbed the scale of the crisis. But what struck him most powerfully wasn't the magnitude of the suffering, devastating as it was. It was how closely these images matched the ones that had first triggered his food-related struggles years earlier. The little girl in one photograph could have been the sister of the child whose image had haunted him since that March afternoon 7 years ago. The same hollow eyes, the same mixture of hope and resignation, the same terrible patience that children develop when hunger becomes a constant companion. The connection between past and present was overwhelming, transforming what should have been a professional briefing into a deeply personal confrontation with his own psychological journey. "Your Royal Highness," said James Crawford from the Department for International Development, "there's been a specific request for royal involvement in the response. The Ethiopian government believes that high-profile attention could significantly increase international donations and political support for emergency aid programs." The request was standard for such situations. Royal involvement in humanitarian crises had a long tradition, dating back generations. The presence of royal family members at fundraising events, their personal appeals for charitable donations, and their visits to crisis regions had historically generated substantial public attention and financial support. But, for William, the prospect of royal involvement in the Ethiopian response raised complex psychological and practical questions. How could he advocate for emergency food aid while struggling to eat his own meals? How could he appear in public settings focused on nutrition and hunger while battling his own food-related demons? How could he represent hope and healing when he felt so personally broken? Dr. Hartwell had warned him about situations exactly like this. During their sessions, they had discussed the possibility that his food issues might interfere with his royal duties, might create conflicts between his personal struggles and his public responsibilities. But they had never developed clear strategies for navigating such conflicts when they arose. "I want to be involved," William said finally, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "But I need to understand exactly what that involvement would look like, and I need honest assessments about whether my personal participation would genuinely help or whether it might create additional complications." The planning session that followed was unlike any William had previously experienced. Typically, royal charitable initiatives were planned with careful attention to protocol, media management, and diplomatic considerations. But this situation required additional layers of complexity, acknowledging without explicitly discussing William's personal relationship with food and its potential impact on his effectiveness as an advocate. Sarah Mitchell, his communications director, had become expert at managing the practical implications of William's food struggles without drawing public attention to them. She understood which types of events worked best, which settings might trigger his more severe reactions, and how to structure his schedule to maximize his advocacy impact while minimizing psychological stress. The most effective approach might be a combination of private meetings with aid organizations, recorded appeals that can be widely distributed, and possibly a visit to refugee communities that have been established in neighboring countries, she suggested. Direct visits to the most affected areas might be logistically complicated given the security situation, but there are ways to create meaningful engagement without placing your Royal Highness in potentially triggering environments. William appreciated the diplomatic language, but he understood what she was really saying. Direct exposure to mass starvation might push his food-related psychological struggles beyond manageable limits. The careful balance he had developed over years of therapy and adaptation could be shattered by confronting the reality of famine on the scale being reported from Ethiopia. But the alternative, remaining safely distant from the crisis while people suffered, felt equally impossible. The photographs from the briefing had reawakened something in William that had been dormant for months, a sense of urgent moral obligation that transcended his personal psychological needs. "I want to see the refugee camps," he said, cutting through the diplomatic hedging. "I want to meet with families who have been affected, and I want to understand firsthand what kinds of support are most needed. We can discuss the logistics later, but I'm not going to advocate for something I haven't personally witnessed." The room fell silent for a moment as advisors exchanged glances, each recognizing the determination in William's voice but also understanding the potential complications his decision might create. Dr. Chen, who had been included in the meeting specifically to address psychological considerations, cleared her throat softly. "Your Royal Highness, I think such a visit could indeed be valuable, both for the humanitarian response and for your personal development. But I'd recommend we implement some additional support structures to help you navigate the psychological challenges you're likely to encounter." The next several hours were spent developing a comprehensive plan that balanced William's desire for meaningful involvement with the practical realities of his food-related struggles. The trip would be structured to maximize his exposure to the humanitarian situation while providing psychological support and escape routes if his reactions became overwhelming. Mrs. Morrison received updated instructions for William's meals during the planning period. His food intake had already been declining as news of the Ethiopian crisis dominated his attention, and the kitchen staff were instructed to prepare even simpler, more basic meals that might feel less morally complicated given the context of his upcoming humanitarian work. Kate joined the planning sessions that evening, bringing her own perspective as someone who had learned to support William's advocacy work while managing the impact on their family life. She had developed her own strategies for remaining psychologically healthy while being married to someone whose empathy had become both a tremendous strength and a significant burden. "The children have been asking questions about the pictures they've seen on the news," she reported to the planning team. "They're old enough to understand that people are suffering, and they want to know what Daddy is going to do to help. George specifically asked whether we could invite hungry children to come live with us." The innocence of the question highlighted one of the central challenges William faced in balancing his role as a father with his humanitarian responsibilities. How do you explain global inequality to children who live in palaces? How do you teach empathy without overwhelming them with guilt? How do you prepare them for future roles of service without burdening them with the psychological weight that had come to define their father's relationship with privilege? That evening, William found himself unable to finish dinner, pushing aside a meal that had been carefully prepared to meet his current psychological needs. The images from the Ethiopian briefing had reawakened the acute awareness of contrast that made eating feel morally impossible. Every bite seemed like a betrayal of the children whose images were burned into his memory. Kate found him later in his study, staring at reports and photographs spread across his desk. She had learned not to offer simple comfort in these moments, not to suggest that his struggles were unnecessary or that he should simply separate his personal eating from global humanitarian issues. Instead, she sat beside him and shared the silence, offering presence without judgment. "I keep thinking about that little girl in the third photograph," William said finally. "She looks exactly like Charlotte did at that age, except she weighs probably half what Charlotte weighs now. How do I go home and watch my daughter eat dinner after seeing something like that?" It was the question that had no good answer, the central paradox that had come to define William's existence. The love he felt for his own children made him more aware of the suffering of other children, but that same awareness made it harder for him to enjoy the simple pleasures of family life that should have been sources of comfort and strength. Dr. Hartwell had addressed this issue during multiple sessions, explaining that William was experiencing what psychologists called survivor guilt despite never having personally experienced the suffering that triggered his responses. His emotional capacity for empathy had developed beyond typical boundaries, creating a psychological condition that was both admirable and unsustainable. "The goal isn't to stop caring," Dr. Hartwell had explained. "The goal is to find ways to care effectively without destroying yourself in the process. Your advocacy is genuinely saving lives, but it won't save anyone if you become unable to function." The Ethiopian trip was scheduled for the following month, pending final security clearances and diplomatic arrangements. William would spend 3 days visiting refugee camps in neighboring Kenya, meeting with families who had fled the drought, and working with aid organizations to understand their most pressing needs. The schedule was deliberately intensive, designed to maximize his exposure to the humanitarian situation while providing structured opportunities for meaningful engagement. But, as the departure date approached, William's eating became increasingly difficult. Breakfast was reduced to a few bites of toast, lunch often skipped entirely, and dinner became a daily struggle that left him exhausted and Kate increasingly worried. The anticipation of confronting mass hunger was making his own food intake feel more morally complicated than ever. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the planning process. William's deep emotional connection to hunger issues was making him an extraordinarily effective advocate, but it was also threatening his ability to maintain basic nutrition. The very empathy that made him so compelling in humanitarian settings was potentially compromising his health and effectiveness. 3 weeks before the scheduled departure, Dr. Chen recommended a radical adjustment to the trip planning. Instead of trying to manage William's food-related struggles separately from his humanitarian work, she suggested integrating them directly into his advocacy approach. "Your personal relationship with food, difficult as it is, represents a profound moral seriousness that could actually enhance your effectiveness as an advocate," she explained during a strategy session. "Rather than hiding these struggles or treating them as obstacles to overcome, we might consider acknowledging them as evidence of your genuine commitment to addressing global hunger." The suggestion was unprecedented in royal charitable work. Traditionally, royal advocates were expected to project confidence, optimism, and emotional stability. The idea of a royal family member publicly acknowledging personal psychological struggles related to their charitable work violated numerous protocols and expectations. But William found the suggestion intriguing rather than alarming. For years, he had felt forced to compartmentalize his personal struggles and his public advocacy to maintain artificial separation between his private psychological battles and his professional humanitarian work. The possibility of integration, of allowing his personal struggles to inform rather than undermine his public service, offered a new approach to both challenges. The decision would fundamentally alter not only his approach to the Ethiopian crisis, but his entire understanding of how personal vulnerability might serve larger purposes of advocacy and leadership. The future king was about to discover whether his greatest weakness might actually become his greatest strength. The refugee camp stretched beyond the horizon under the relentless East African sun, a sprawling city of temporary shelters that had become home to over 80,000 people. From the helicopter window, William could see the geometric precision of the camp layout, the orderly rows of tents and makeshift structures that represented one of humanity's most organized responses to human suffering. But, as they descended toward the landing area, the organizational precision gave way to a more complex reality. Children played between the shelters despite their circumstances, mothers carried water containers along dusty paths that had been worn into the red earth by thousands of daily journeys, and everywhere there were the subtle signs of a community that had adapted to conditions no community should ever have to endure. William's stomach was empty. He had been unable to eat breakfast that morning, his appetite completely suppressed by the anticipation of what he was about to witness. Dr. Chen had warned him that his food-related anxieties might intensify during the trip, but nothing could have prepared him for the physical response he was experiencing. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to disembark from the helicopter, and he found himself questioning whether he was psychologically ready for what lay ahead. Amara Hassan, the camp director for the UNHCR, met him at the landing area. She was a woman in her 40s who carried herself with the quiet authority that comes from years of managing impossible situations with inadequate resources. Her greeting was warm but efficient, reflecting the reality that every minute spent on protocol was a minute not spent addressing urgent human needs. Your Royal Highness, welcome to Dadaab Extension Camp. We're honored by your visit, but I want to be direct about what you're going to see today. This camp is operating at nearly 3 times its intended capacity, and the nutritional situation is more severe than our public reports indicate. William nodded, appreciating her directness. He had specifically requested that his visit not be sanitized or choreographed to minimize the impact of what he witnessed. If his advocacy was going to be effective, it needed to be based on unfiltered reality rather than diplomatic presentations designed to avoid discomfort. The first stop was the camp's main feeding center, a large tent structure where severely malnourished children receive therapeutic nutrition. As they approached the entrance, William could hear the sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the weak cries of infants too malnourished to produce strong sounds, the quiet conversations of mothers speaking in languages he didn't understand but with emotions that transcended linguistic barriers. Inside the feeding center, William encountered something that shattered every remaining barrier between his intellectual understanding of hunger and his visceral comprehension of its reality. Tiny children, some no older than his son Louis, lay on mats while medical staff administered carefully measured nutrition through feeding tubes. Their eyes followed movement with the alertness that paradoxically accompanies severe malnutrition, but their bodies showed the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation. Dr. Sarah Aching, the camp's head nutritionist, provided clinical explanations as they moved through the facility. We're currently treating over 1,500 children for severe acute malnutrition, she explained, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the emotional weight of her work. The cases you're seeing here are the most severe, children who require intensive medical intervention to survive. William found himself studying each child with an intensity that concerned his security team. He knelt beside mats where mothers held infants who weighed less than healthy newborns despite being 6 months or a year old. He listened to stories translated by camp interpreters, learning about journeys across hundreds of miles of drought-stricken landscape, about families who had lost everything except their determination to keep their children alive. But what struck him most powerfully wasn't the severity of the malnutrition, devastating as it was. It was the dignity with which families faced their circumstances, the careful attention mothers paid to their children despite having inadequate resources, the community bonds that had formed even in temporary shelters. These weren't just victims of circumstance, they were people who had maintained their humanity and hope despite facing conditions that would have broken many others. Fatima al-Rashid, a mother of 4 who had arrived at the camp 3 weeks earlier, agreed to speak with William through an interpreter. Her story was both unique and representative: a family farm destroyed by 3 consecutive years of failed rains, a husband who had died during their journey to the camp, children who had not eaten a full meal in weeks before arriving at Dadaab. She wants you to understand, the interpreter explained, that she's not asking for charity. She's asking for the chance to rebuild, to return home when the rains come, to provide for her children the way she did before the drought. The distinction was crucial, and it forced William to reconsider his entire approach to humanitarian advocacy. These weren't people who needed to be rescued, they were people who needed support to rescue themselves. The difference was fundamental, shifting the focus from charity to justice, from temporary relief to sustainable solutions. As the day progressed, William's own relationship with food became increasingly complex. The camp dining facilities served simple meals to refugees, carefully calculated to provide essential nutrition within severe budget constraints. The meals were basic but adequate, prepared with the precision that comes from knowing that every calorie matters when resources are limited. William was invited to share a meal with several families, an honor that represented trust and hospitality despite their circumstances. But sitting down to eat in that environment felt impossible. How could he consume food in front of children who had been starving weeks earlier? How could he participate in a meal that, however simple, represented more nutrition than many camp residents had access to on a regular basis? The families noticed his hesitation, and, through interpreters, they began to understand that their royal visitor was struggling with something more complex than simple lack of appetite. Fatima spoke again, her words translated with careful attention to their emotional weight. She says that refusing to eat with them would be more insulting than eating would be inconsiderate. She says that sharing food is how people show respect for each other, and that your worries about eating in front of them shows that you understand something important about hunger. The perspective was transformative for William. His food-related struggles, which had felt like personal weakness or psychological indulgence, were being reframed as evidence of moral understanding. His discomfort with eating in the presence of hunger wasn't a problem to be solved, it was a response to be honored and channeled into effective action. He ate the simple meal slowly, thoughtfully, with an awareness of every bite that was both painful and profound. The food was basic but nourishing, prepared with care despite limited resources, shared with generosity despite scarcity. The experience was unlike any meal he had ever consumed, transforming eating from a personal struggle into a communal act of recognition and respect. After the meal, William spent time with camp administrators, learning about the logistical challenges of feeding 80,000 people daily with fluctuating resources and unpredictable funding. The statistics were staggering. The camp required over 40 tons of food daily, needed constant coordination with international suppliers, and operated on budgets that could be disrupted by political decisions made thousands of miles away. But, more important than the logistical challenges were the human stories that lay behind every statistic. Each ton of food represented hundreds of individual meals, each meal represented a family's survival for another day, and each family represented hopes and dreams and aspirations that transcended their current circumstances. Emmanuel Kapratic, a camp administrator who had been working in refugee settings for over a decade, walked William through the camp's food distribution systems. The process was remarkable in its complexity and precision. Individual families received specific allocations based on family size and nutritional needs. Distributions were scheduled to maximize efficiency while maintaining dignity, and careful records ensured that limited resources reached those who needed them most. The most important thing to understand, Emmanuel explained, is that this isn't just about calories. It's about maintaining community, preserving dignity, and providing hope that current circumstances are temporary rather than permanent. The insight resonated powerfully with William's own struggles. His food-related difficulties weren't really about nutrition either, they were about dignity, community, and hope. His inability to enjoy meals in the presence of global hunger was actually a healthy response to unhealthy circumstances, a recognition that individual consumption couldn't be separated from collective welfare. As evening approached, William attended a community meeting where camp residents discussed their hopes for the future. The conversations, translated into English, revealed aspirations that went far beyond basic survival. People spoke about children they wanted to educate, skills they hoped to develop, communities they planned to rebuild when conditions allowed them to return home. The meeting transformed William's understanding of refugee experiences. These weren't people who had given up hope or resigned themselves to permanent dependence. They were people who were temporarily displaced but remained committed to rebuilding their lives when circumstances allowed. Their current reliance on humanitarian aid was a bridge to future self-sufficiency rather than an acceptance of permanent dependency. That evening, in the modest accommodation that had been arranged for his visit, William reflected on the day's experiences. The camp had been more challenging and more inspiring than he had anticipated. The level of suffering was indeed severe, but it was accompanied by resilience, community solidarity, and hope that put his own struggles into perspective. For the first time in years, William's food-related anxieties felt productive rather than paralyzing. His discomfort with eating in the presence of hunger had led to deeper conversations, more meaningful connections, and better understanding of the issues he was trying to address. His personal struggles had become a bridge to empathy rather than a barrier to effectiveness. Dr. Chen had been right about the potential for integration rather than compartmentalization. William's psychological relationship with food, difficult as it remained, was actually enhancing his advocacy work rather than undermining it. His visible discomfort with eating in contexts of hunger was communicating authenticity and moral seriousness that traditional royal approaches couldn't match. The second day of his visit would bring new challenges and deeper understanding, but William fell asleep with a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for months. The future king was beginning to understand how personal vulnerability might serve larger purposes of leadership and service, how individual struggle might contribute to collective healing. tomorrow would bring opportunities to meet with additional families, to visit agricultural projects designed to prevent future food crises, and to work with local leaders developing long-term solutions to problems that went far beyond emergency relief. The work would continue, the learning would deepen, and, gradually, William would discover new ways to channel his empathy into sustainable action. His relationship with food would never be simple again, but it was becoming something more important, a source of connection, understanding, and moral clarity that would inform his approach to leadership for the rest of his life. 6 months after returning from the refugee camps, William stood in the same grand dining hall at Buckingham Palace where his journey had begun. The crystal chandeliers cast the same dancing shadows, the mahogany tables bore the same royal crests, and the silver cutlery gleamed with the same polished perfection. But everything else had fundamentally changed. The evening's guests were different this time, representatives from humanitarian organizations, agricultural specialists working on food security initiatives, and former refugees who had successfully resettled in Britain and built new lives. The menu had been revolutionary by royal standards, featuring simple, locally sourced dishes that honored both British culinary traditions and the practical realities of global food systems. William sat at the head of the table, but this time his plate wasn't untouched. He was eating slowly, thoughtfully, with the careful attention that had become his signature approach to meals. Each bite was deliberate, mindful, connected to broader awareness of food systems and global inequality. But it was no longer paralyzed by guilt or overwhelmed by moral complexity. The transformation hadn't been sudden or simple. The months following his visit to the refugee camps had been filled with continued therapy, gradual changes in approach, and careful experimentation with new ways of understanding food, privilege, and responsibility. Dr. Chen and Dr. Hartwell had worked together to help him develop what they called integrated awareness, a psychological framework that honored his moral sensitivity while maintaining functional capacity for daily life. Lady Margaret Thornberry, seated in the same position she had occupied months earlier, watched William with amazement. The tension that had characterized his relationship with food for years had been replaced by something more complex but ultimately more sustainable, conscious engagement rather than anxious avoidance. The difference was visible in multiple ways. William now ate more slowly than before his struggles began, but he was eating complete meals for the first time in years. He asked questions about food sources, preparation methods, and supply chains, but the questions came from curiosity rather than anxiety. Most importantly, he was able to enjoy meals while maintaining awareness of broader food justice issues, finding balance between personal nourishment and global consciousness. The evening's conversation centered on a new initiative that had emerged from William's experiences in East Africa. The Conscious Consumption Project was designed to help individuals and organizations make food choices that balanced personal needs with awareness of global food systems. Rather than promoting guilt about eating, the project encouraged informed engagement with food sources, ethical consumption practices, and direct action to address systemic inequality. Dr. Amanda Richards, who had provided the devastating briefings about the Ethiopian crisis, was now working with the royal family to develop educational programs that connected local food choices with global humanitarian outcomes. Her presentation that evening focused on practical strategies for conscious eating that were sustainable both psychologically and practically. The goal isn't to make people feel guilty about eating, she explained to the assembled guests. The goal is to help people understand how their choices can contribute to positive change, how personal consumption can be aligned with values of justice and sustainability. The approach represented everything William had learned about integrating personal struggles with public service. Rather than compartmentalizing his food-related concerns, he was channeling them into educational and advocacy initiatives that could benefit others facing similar challenges. His personal journey was becoming a resource for broader social change. Emmanuel Kiprodic, the camp administrator from Dadaab, had accepted an invitation to join the evening's program via video conference. Speaking from Kenya, he provided updates on the families William had met during his visit, sharing stories of progress, challenges, and hope that connected the palace dinner to ongoing realities half a world away. Fatima al-Rashid wants Your Royal Highness to know that her children are now attending school in the camp, Emmanuel reported. She asked me to tell you that sharing that meal with you gave her family hope that their circumstances were temporary, that people in positions of power genuinely cared about their welfare. The update was deeply moving for William, but it also illustrated the broader lesson he had learned about the relationship between personal struggle and effective advocacy. His visible discomfort with eating in the presence of hunger had communicated authenticity and moral seriousness that traditional royal approaches couldn't match. His psychological struggles had actually enhanced rather than undermined his effectiveness as an advocate. Kate, seated beside William, had her own stories to share about how the family's approach to food had evolved. The children were now involved in age-appropriate discussions about global inequality, food systems, and their family's responsibility to use their privilege constructively. But, rather than being burdened by guilt, they were being empowered with knowledge and opportunities for meaningful action. "George has started asking questions about where our food comes from," Kate reported to the group. "But, instead of feeling overwhelmed by the complexity, he's excited about learning to make choices that align with our family values. Last week, he helped us research local farms and made suggestions about adjusting our purchasing to support more ethical suppliers." The children's involvement represented another crucial aspect of William's transformation. Rather than trying to protect them from awareness of global inequality, he and Kate were teaching them to engage constructively with these realities. The goal was to raise children who would be conscious of their privilege without being paralyzed by it, who would feel responsibility without being crushed by guilt. Mrs. Morrison, the palace chef who had struggled for years to prepare meals that William could psychologically manage, was also present for the evening's program. Her perspective on the transformation was particularly valuable, having witnessed the daily reality of William's struggles and gradual healing. "The change isn't just that His Royal Highness is eating more regularly," she explained to the group. "The change is that he's eating with purpose and joy again. He asks questions about ingredients and preparation methods, makes suggestions about incorporating more ethical sourcing, and expresses genuine appreciation for meals that align with the family's values." The transformation in William's relationship with food had required corresponding changes throughout the palace systems. The royal kitchens now prioritized local sourcing, seasonal menus, and minimal waste practices. Food preparation emphasized simple, nutritious meals rather than elaborate displays of culinary excess. Most importantly, meal planning included consideration of broader social and environmental impacts, integrating ethical concerns into practical decisions. But, the changes went beyond personal and household adjustments. William's public advocacy work had been transformed by his integrated approach to food-related issues. His speeches about hunger and food security now carried emotional weight and authenticity that resonated powerfully with audiences. His visits to food banks, agricultural projects, and humanitarian organizations were marked by genuine engagement rather than diplomatic obligation. The Trussell Trust's Sarah Thompson, present for the evening's discussion, provided updates on how William's advocacy had impacted their work. "His Royal Highness's approach to these issues has been transformational for our organization," she reported. "His personal investment in understanding food insecurity, his willingness to engage with complex moral questions about consumption and inequality, has inspired both our staff and our clients." The advocacy work was having measurable impact. Food bank donations had increased significantly following William's high-profile campaigns. Government funding for food security initiatives had expanded after his parliamentary testimony about global hunger issues. International development organizations reported increased public support for their work following royal advocacy efforts. But, beyond the practical impacts, William's approach was changing broader conversations about privilege, responsibility, and ethical consumption. His willingness to discuss personal struggles publicly had encouraged others to examine their own relationships with food, consumption, and global inequality. His model of conscious engagement rather than paralyzed guilt was providing frameworks for others facing similar moral challenges. Dr. Hartwell, attending the dinner as both a professional advisor and personal guest, reflected on William's journey during her remarks to the group. "What His Royal Highness has demonstrated is that moral sensitivity doesn't have to be psychologically destructive. Personal struggle can become a source of insight and authenticity that enhances rather than undermines public service." The insight had implications far beyond food-related issues. William's experience was providing models for how leaders might engage with complex moral challenges without being overwhelmed by them, how privilege might be channeled into constructive action rather than destructive guilt, how personal vulnerability might serve larger purposes of advocacy and change. As the evening progressed, William found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this point. The struggles had been real, the psychological cost enormous, the impact on his family significant. But, the outcome was something he couldn't have imagined when his food-related anxieties first began: a more authentic relationship with his role as future king, deeper connections with the issues that mattered most to him, and practical approaches to addressing global inequality that were both effective and sustainable. The meal concluded with a dessert that perfectly symbolized William's transformation, a simple fruit tart made with apples from the palace gardens, prepared according to traditional recipes but incorporating principles of minimal waste and ethical sourcing. The dessert was delicious, but, more importantly, it represented food that could be enjoyed without moral compromise, nourishment that aligned with values rather than contradicting them. As guests began to depart, William remained in the dining hall, reflecting on the evening and its significance. The room that had once represented everything wrong with his relationship with privilege and consumption had become a space for meaningful engagement with the issues that defined his sense of purpose. The transformation was complete, but the work was just beginning. The future King of England had learned that leadership isn't about having all the answers or maintaining perfect composure in the face of overwhelming challenges. Leadership is about channeling personal struggles into constructive action, using privilege to address inequality, and finding sustainable ways to care about others without destroying yourself in the process. William's relationship with food would never be simple or uncomplicated. Every meal would continue to carry awareness of global inequality, every bite would remain connected to consciousness of broader food systems and humanitarian concerns. But that awareness had become a source of strength rather than paralysis, a foundation for effective action rather than psychological torment. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for advocacy, new challenges in balancing personal needs with global consciousness, and continued work to address the systemic issues that had originally triggered his struggles. The future king would approach those challenges with hard-won wisdom about the relationship between personal vulnerability and public service, carrying forward lessons that would inform his leadership for the rest of his life. The transformation was complete, but the mission was eternal, using privilege constructively, addressing inequality systematically, and demonstrating that caring deeply about others doesn't require sacrificing your own capacity to function and serve. William had learned to eat again, but, more importantly, he had learned how to lead with both heart and head, with both passion and sustainability, with both moral courage and practical wisdom.